Hi, it's Connor Engel back with another topic analysis for DebateDrills. This time we'll be looking at the resolution States ought to eliminate their nuclear arsenals. We'll be reviewing a few different philosophers Kant, Locke, Machiavelli, as well as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who I'm grouping together because they share the general same philosophy. So let's get into it. First, we'll discuss Kantianism. Kantianism is a potential AF on this topic, and we'll discuss the thesis of it. So, the first principle of all Kantian theory is the categorical imperative, also known as universalizability. It is to act according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Essentially, Kant believed that morality was rooted in rationality and logic, and to act according to anything that could not become a universal law would be simply to act illogically and therefore immorally. Universal law can be violated by one of three contradictions in conception or willing: the logical, the practical, and the teleological. In cases of logical contradiction, it is a question of if the maxim were universalized, the action or policy that it proposes would be inconceivable. To provide an example for this, let's look at the practice of providing loans. Let's imagine a world in which people simply did not pay back the loans they were given. Kant would argue that this is a logical contradiction in conception, because we can't conceive of a practice of loan giving that allows people to not pay back their loans. This would make the practice of loans simply completely incoherent. How could I allow for a social contract in which I give someone money in return for more money at a later date if I was to expect that they would simply never return me that money? The whole concept of a loan would make no sense. Next, we can look at the practical contradiction, that your action would become ineffectual for the achievement of your purpose if everyone tried to use it for that purpose. For this, we can potentially look to the act of murder. Murder is practically contradictory because in a world in which everyone is able to murder everyone else, I would probably not be able to murder the person I wanted to because somebody else would have previously murdered me. Thus, my ability to murder others is limited by others' ability to murder me. Thus, it is a practical contradiction. Lastly, there's teleological contradiction. This is another contradiction in conception. Kant believed that any organ, instinct, or action type has a natural purpose from which the one must best be suited. This essentially means that he thought that all humans had an inherent nature and purpose. Now, this is the least used contradiction because it's always unclear from where Kant derived these purposes and natures, or exactly what the nature or purpose of humanity can be considered today. For Kant, he thought there were general purposes in nature, such as always wanting to improve the faculties that we already possess. So, for example, if I were an incredibly good juggler, but I never practiced juggling, this would be a teleological contradiction, because I would be letting my latent juggling skills go to waste. Next, we can view a formulation of the categorical imperative, which is to say, another part of the categorical imperative, to which there are four. For the purposes of the thesis, we'll simply examine this first one: to evaluate someone as an end in and of themselves and not as a means. In other words, act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a mere means. Now, what it means to be an end is that all people have the purpose to live for themselves. Therefore, to use someone for your own purposes is to use them as a means for your purpose and not treat them as an ends for their own purpose. Due to the fact that we're rational and can will autonomous actions, Kant believed this imbued us with an absolute moral worth that could never be violated. So, for example, to return to the instance of murder, to murder someone is to use a person's very life as a means to achieve the pleasure or some end goal of murdering. This is something that cannot be done in any scenario, whether large or small, murder obviously being the most extreme example, but I, for example, could not even lie to someone in order to make them like me more, because this would still be using their trust as a means to get them to like me. Now, how does this apply to the topic? Well, first, nuclear deterrence itself is considered an immoral threat. It uses people as a means to an end by holding innocents hostage in order to deter war. Here, the innocent in a country is being used as a hostage, as a means to deter their government from potentially attacking another country that possesses nuclear weapons, given that there is an implicit threat of retaliation against that country's populace. Now, B, it is also a practical contradiction, because if everybody applied these open threats, they would lose their meaning, because they would become the rhetorical norm. The more a threat is used, the less it is meaningful, as we all know from social interaction. And if every country in the entire world threatened every single other country with annihilation, but there was never any annihilation, we would all quickly realize that this was simply an empty threat. Thus, it would lose all of its potential. Second, nuclear deterrence is a commitment to an immoral action. A threat is semantically a promise to retaliate, and the threat of nuclear deterrence is a promise to retaliate with the murder of mass civilians. Murder uses people clearly as a means to an end, as we have already established, and is also, as we have established, a practical contradiction. To put it simply, something that is wrong to do is therefore wrong to threaten, and since murder and the killing of civilians is wrong, it is therefore wrong to threaten to do so. Third, nuclear deterrence forces others to use nuclear weapons. Essentially, a country possessing nuclear weapons will immediately cause other countries to react in order to create a weapon of their own. This is generally because nuclear weapons operate on a principle of mutually assured destruction. In other words, a nuke is effective because if attacked, a country will launch a nuke and destroy the other. But if that other country has nukes, they will retaliate as well, destroying the original country. Ultimately, it means that no country will attack each other because every country fears risk of annihilation via nuclear weapons. But this causes other countries to need to build nukes in order to maintain this order of mutually assured destruction, using them as a means to an end of establishing global security. And though we may usually think of something like global security as a good thing, if it still uses a person or country as a means to an end, we can regard it as bad via a Kantian analysis. Lastly, nuclear weapons are undemocratic. While this is a little-known fact about Kantianism, Kant did believe greatly in the democratic process. And because nuclear weapons can be launched without popular consent, it creates a logical contradiction in the democratic process itself, because we don't have any input as to when a nuclear weapon is being launched. Next, we'll look at John Locke. John Locke was a philosopher writing around the time of Thomas Hobbes, who had a similar theory of a state of nature. In other words, without a government possessing the authority to adjudicate between disputes, the state of nature would devolve to a constant war over resources, the state of nature being the existence of a community or a sort of state of living in which there is no government or societal regulation. There's just people living in chaos, essentially, in anarchy. Locke also believed in the social contract. In other words, the tacit agreement to concede certain rights in exchange for the protection and legal mediation provided by a government. I pay taxes, I respect the law and the rights of others, so that the law will respect and protect my rights. Lastly, government legitimacy is upheld by the social contract, and citizens must therefore have some way in the fashion that the government operates, which is usually accessed by some sort of democratic process. We would never agree to give up our rights to a government which refuses to respect our opinions about how those rights ought to be protected and applied. Now, John Locke is a philosopher who has many contemporaries. Other philosophers like John Rawls and Rousseau take from Locke's writings and are sort of not necessarily interchangeable, but share many of the same concepts. So many of the concepts discussed here will also be applicable to other theories of social philosophy and discussions of governmental philosophy as well. So to discuss some of the more topical arguments, we can first see that nuclear weapons are undemocratic. As previously discussed with Kantian doctrine, the secrecy and immediacy of a nuclear launch violates the social contract by preventing any democratic process from mediating or regulating the use of nuclear weapons. As soon as a nuclear launch is detected against our country, the nukes are fired via a small cabal of people operating those nuclear weapons, as well as the president and perhaps his or her advisors. This in no way allows us to potentially mediate that through use of a popular vote. B. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution requires a congressional declaration of war, which is circumvented by the same immediate nuclear retaliation. This also prevents any sort of representative democracy from taking effect and hold of the use of nuclear weapons. Even ordinary nuclear launch doctrine that is not necessarily immediate can be implemented by simply the president and other relevant military officials without the need for congressional approval. Second, nuclear weapons threaten to create another state of nature. Nuclear weapons are devastating enough to destroy the entire infrastructure of a country and reduce us again to a state of chaos and lawlessness in which there is no body protecting us. This would lead to a state of infinite rights violations, which Locke would see as the worst possible outcome, and thus probably could not be risked simply from the possession of nuclear weapons. Third, the only way to civilize force is to distribute it. Essentially, Locke was against the use of military power by a single individual. The use of nuclear weapons invests too much military power into one actor or a small group of military officials and disrupts the democratic, distributive nature of the application of this force and of the creation of war. B, this is actually borne out in the Second Amendment of the Constitution, which greatly implies that an individual citizen's right to bear arms is also their right to apply those arms, or to apply force generally. This means that when we say citizens have the right to bear arms, we're not simply saying that they have the right to possess guns, but the right to determine how the violence of those guns ought to be distributed and used. As a result, the nuclear weapon, which is the ultimate arm and the aggregation of the greatest amount of force for our country, is therefore used without any individual consent of the citizens, thus robbing the distributive nature of force that is required by the Second Amendment, and again violating the social contract. Next, we'll talk about particular neg arguments. On this topic, the neg ground for philosophy is actually quite weak. The unfortunate case is that very few philosophers defend the use of such large weapons like nukes, as well as the implications that such nukes could be used to target civilians. Very few philosophers would ever risk or believe that the death of innocents is something that is actively preferable. However, there are some philosophers, such as Machiavelli, who would actually applaud this use of force. Now, as a caveat, Machiavelli himself was a generally morally corrupt person. By today's more progressive social standards, Machiavelli's beliefs about women, potentially minorities, are abhorrent, and I would not suggest that anyone defend the entirety of his philosophy on balance. Rather, I am going to use Machiavelli as an example of how we can discuss a less philosophical and more international theoretical application of a philosophy known as realism. And though realism is itself not a formally rooted philosophical framework, it can be applied in certain ways to augment the negative argumentation and negative strategy. And we can even use Machiavelli's own beliefs, given that they are parametricized to a very discrete set of moral beliefs, and again, not defending his entire moral calculus in general. First, Machiavelli forwarded the belief that the strong must rule. This is essentially the distilled argument for realism, that anarchy and destruction will occur in a kingdom when there's no ruler strong enough to rein in the ambition of self-interested individuals. The same would hold true for international politics. The doctrine of realism holds that all states and international actors are inherently self-interested, not cooperative. This means that states will do anything they possibly can to accrue as many resources as they can for their own citizens and their own infrastructure. As such, the only way to prevent conflict is to be the most powerful and therefore hold dominion over other states, which disincentivizes them from engaging in conflict for fear of somehow angering you or disrupting your rule. Next, Machiavelli believed in a prudent morality. And for a ruler, all forms of morality are meaningless. Their definitional purpose is to preserve the existence of the state and its people. To this end, a ruler must be willing to use any means, good or cruel, in order to protect their populace. This would justify essentially a utilitarian way of viewing rule, which means that we can use any weapons, any tools at our disposal in order to protect our country and protect our citizens. We will expand slightly more upon this when we talk about utilitarianism. Lastly, there's the deceit of the ruler, that it is imperative that a ruler appear just toward their citizens, but cruel toward their enemies. This preserves their legitimacy amongst the governed by making them think that they are reasonable and moral governors, but controls their enemies with fear by making them think that they are brutal and will exert any force necessary to prevent any imposition of force upon their citizens. Now, in terms of topic arguments, this manifests themselves in two ways. First, nuclear weapons are the ultimate tool of regulation and preservation. Only nuclear weapons are powerful enough to allow a leader to properly protect their country's populace. Any other conventional weapon could fail to destroy armies or the necessary military infrastructure of other countries, and therefore fail to prevent an invasion. political realist doctrine is true. Therefore, only the threat of nuclear annihilation and mutually assured destruction, as discussed previously, would deter conflict and self-interest between international states and actors. Second, nuclear weapons adhere to the deceit of the ruler by creating both benevolence and fear. A country's populace will always view their rulers as just due to the inherent restrictions already placed on nuclear weapons, but a country's enemies will regard them with fear due to the consistent potential ability to use those weapons to annihilate them. Lastly, we'll talk about the topic of utilitarianism, which could be both applied on the affirmative as well as the negative. Now, utilitarianism in debate is generally tended to be associated with policy arguments, arguments that assume that the greatest good for the greatest number of people is the only thing that is morally relevant. Here we'll talk about the actual moral underpinnings of this argument and how you can apply utilitarianism in an actual philosophical debate with other debaters, instead of simply assuming these arguments are true or reading moral shortcuts like Bostrom, which ignore the actual moral content of an argument and focus solely on the general pragmatic content. First, utilitarianism adheres to a metaphysics of consequentialism, in which the morality of an action is based upon its consequences. This contrasts with Kantianism, in which the morality of an action is based upon its intent. The difference being that in a utilitarian or consequentialist notion, if I see a bug on your face and slap you with an intent to simply kill the bug and not harm you, because you are harmed, that is an immoral action. A Kantian would say this is still a moral action, given that my intent was to help you and not necessarily to hurt you. Now we can verify utilitarianism through a process called phenomenological introspection. In other words, the understanding of personal experience. Utilitarians argue the only thing that all people can verify and understand is the experience of pain. So insofar as we understand that others are like us and they are human beings, we therefore understand that they feel pain like we do, and so we can intuit that inflicting pain upon them would be wrong. Lastly, there's the principle of utility, that we should always act as to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This is other-regarding and non-egoistic, which means unlike other moral theories, even though utilitarians believe that the greatest good could also be the greatest pleasure, and is therefore considered a hedonistic morality, it means that we have an obligation to help others and not solely ourselves, because the greatest good for the greatest number is important, not simply the greatest good for ourselves. Here we see the establishment of inherent duty. If we're able to act, then we always have a moral duty to act to minimize harm, even at a cost to ourselves. This is because the greatest good for the greatest number requires that we help others, because even if there is some harm to ourselves, on balance, the benefit to others will outweigh that harm. Next, there is a distinction between act and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarians will take any action which leads to the greatest good for the greatest number of people, while rule utilitarians act via consistent moral rules, which in general lead to the greatest good for the greatest number of people. For example, let's assume a doctor has 5 patients come in one day, each with a different failing organ. The doctor knows of a perfect match for each organ who is lazy, immoral, and generally a drag on society. The doctor knows that he could kidnap this singular patient, kill them, and then dole out their organs to the 5 unhealthy patients, thereby curing them and creating the greatest good for the greatest number of people by eliminating a drag on society and benefiting 5 incredibly productive citizens. Now, an act utilitarian would say that this is a moral good. Because pain is simply equal and distributed and aggregated equally, even though killing him causes a tremendous amount of pain to that singular person, on the whole, more good comes of that person being killed and of their organs being given to the 5, who experience a great amount of pleasure, given that they will not die of individual organ failure, and that they will continue to be able to benefit society, which creates pleasure for a great number of other people. But an act utilitarian would evaluate this as a generally bad moral rule. Our ability to simply kill innocent people for their organs would probably make for quite a terrible society, and one in which we are all quite afraid of going to hospitals. Thus, they understand that the application of this moral rule would overall create a great harm for a great number of people. The distinction here is important because it'll change the way in which you engage in utilitarian argumentation. Lastly, utilitarians are greatly concerned with government obligations. They believe a government, by definition, must act to mediate the wills of its people, and therefore requires action in a utilitarian fashion. Otherwise, the social contract, as previously discussed, would be incoherent, and governments would lose their legitimacy because their only purpose is to help others. If they're unable to do so, then they are simply not a government. And only utilitarianism can help all citizens because it maximizes good. But if the government were to act via moral side constraints like Kantianism, it would often fail to intervene to act others because they might not want to perform an immoral action. For example, a government may refuse to kill a single terrorist who is threatening to blow up a bomb which kills an entire city. This being a fair use of Kantian morality because it is still an intent to kill, and killing uses that person as a means to an end. But a government simply cannot operate if they consider the interest of one singular person over the interests of their populace writ large. This can be applied to the topic very intuitively. Any argument which would indicate why eliminating or keeping nuclear arsenals would result in the greatest good for the greatest number of people would be a utilitarian argument. You can see the policy topic analysis for more examples, but in terms of affirmative examples, you can have miscalculation arguments about the incorrect use of nuclear weapons, the India versus Pakistan nuclear war scenario, as well as scenarios of nuclear terrorism. Such arguments could also potentially be made on the negative, in which India and Pakistan can only stop going to war because of a principle of mutually assured destruction. Hopefully, this gives a good guide as to what to look for when examining philosophical literature on this topic. This is by no means a comprehensive investigation of all philosophy on this topic, so feel free to be creative and push your boundaries. Know that a lot of these philosophers have overlap with others, so a lot of the concepts discussed here will be also mentioned in other philosophies, and that this is generally a brief discussion of each one of these philosophers, and the general fuller understanding of each one of these philosophies can only be ascertained by actually doing the research, and reading about these philosophers yourself. I hope you have a good time with this topic, and we hope you have fun debating.